Scream. You worthless trash. Just as pathetic and broke as your owner. The heavy steel bottle slammed down hard. Max, the retired K9 who had saved my life on the battlefield, the only living soul I considered family, collapsed onto the grass, whimpering and trembling. Standing right in front of me was Julian Reyes, my 19-year-old silver spoon nephew, laughing sadistically into a live stream camera. In that punk's eyes, violently attacking a harmless homeless woman's dog was the perfect bait for views. Julian had no idea the beggar he was trampling on was his own biological aunt. And the biggest mistake of that arrogant kid's life was personally unlocking the cage of a monster. Watching my loyal brother in arms, writhing in pain, the patient disguise I had worn for 3 years shattered. I slowly looked up, locking eyes directly with my own flesh and blood. The hands that had once barehandedly neutralized 43 of the world's most dangerous gunmen as a Navy SEAL captain slowly clenched into fists. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. But only if this story resonates with you, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. My clenched fists in the park dirt sent a jolt straight through my spine, dragging me 30 years backward to the exact same tension locked inside a 15-year-old girl's body. Same snorts, white knuckles. Same suppressed rage, different cage. I was 15 years old again, standing in the suffocatingly grand dining room of the Reyes estate in Westport. The ceilings stretched impossibly high, engineered to make anyone standing beneath them feel insignificant. My brother, already a rising real estate tyrant in his 20s, sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He did not look at me as a sister. His eyes scanned me the way he scanned a defective property listing, searching for the quickest way to demolish and rebuild on top of the wreckage. He swirled his expensive whiskey. The ice clinked loudly against the crystal glass, a deliberate rhythmic sound that drowned out every attempt I made to speak. The suffocating stench of his Cuban cigar filled the entire room, turning the air thick and heavy. I tightened my grip under the table, my fingernails digging so deeply into my own palms that I felt the skin split. He reached across the polished mahogany surface and casually slid my dinner plate away from me without breaking eye contact, pushing it toward the empty chair as if my presence at the table was a clerical error he was correcting. I watched the food I had waited an hour to eat slide out of my reach. I refused to let him see me cry. I refused to give him the satisfaction of knowing he was breaking me, piece by piece. He thrived on fear, demanding absolute submission from everyone who lived under his roof. To him, my existence was merely an inconvenience, a flaw in the perfect image he was projecting to the elite circles of Westport. I stood there in complete silence, realizing that in this house, blood meant absolutely nothing compared to control. My brother methodically isolated me from the rest of the world. Over the following years, he gaslit our aging parents into believing I was mentally unstable and rebellious, successfully painting me as the shameful stain on his perfectly curated public image. He controlled who visited me, who spoke to me, and who acknowledged my presence at family functions. He actively intercepted my college applications, replacing them with fake rejection letters he had forged himself just to watch my hope die. I found the torn remnants of my real acceptance letters buried deep in his study's wastebasket, along with a yellow legal notepad covered in his handwriting, where he had practiced the university registrar's signature over and over until the forgery was flawless. The careful, patient repetition on that notepad chilled me. This was not impulsive cruelty. This was engineered destruction. When I confronted him walking into his massive office with the torn papers clutched in my trembling hands, he did not even look up from his financial reports. He casually tapped his solid gold pen against the leather desk mat, the rhythmic sound echoing in the cold room like a metronome, counting down the seconds of my dignity. "You are a liability," he sneered, his voice dripping with weaponized arrogance and cold calculation. "I am the architect of this family's future. You are just the dirt I build upon." I did not scream at him. I did not throw a tantrum or beg for his love. I simply stepped back, feeling my facial muscles lock into a mask of pure ice. In that exact moment, the vulnerable little sister died. replaced permanently by a cold observer analyzing a hostile target. Fighting him with tears was useless. I needed a tactical escape. The final breaking point came a few months later at his lavish engagement gala. I was forced to attend, stuffed into an itchy, suffocating, designer gown that I had no say in choosing, paraded around like the problematic little sister who needed to be fixed and displayed. We were standing in the center of the grand ballroom, surrounded by over 200 of the town's wealthiest elite investors. Their diamond-studded wives dripping with jewelry that cost more than most families earn in a decade. And every ambitious politician my brother had already purchased and placed in his pocket like loose change. My brother tapped his silver spoon against his champagne flute, commanding the absolute attention of the entire room. The chatter died instantly. He raised his glass, his eyes locking onto mine with a cruel, predatory gleam. He smirked, pointing directly at me in front of hundreds of people, making sure every single set of eyes in the room followed his finger to my face, and to my little sister, whose only talent is draining the trust fund I manage for her. Let us hope she finds a husband blind enough to ignore her complete lack of ambition. The crowd erupted into polite, mocking laughter, their eyes burning holes into my skin. I felt every gaze like a lit match pressed against my neck. The humiliation scorched my throat like acid, but I swallowed it down. I refused to break character. I did not argue or run away crying. I looked him dead in the eye and set my crystal glass down on a passing waiter's tray with a sharp, definitive click. The decision was made in that exact microcond. I was done playing the victim in his twisted game of power. At 3:00 in the morning, while the massive mansion slept off its drunken arrogance, I moved with silent precision. I packed a single heavy canvas duffel bag, with only the barest essentials. I stripped off the expensive diamond necklace and earrings, leaving them entirely on the mahogany dresser, arranged neatly beside a perfume bottle I had never asked for. By doing this, I was officially abandoning the wealth of the Reyes family. I walked out the back service door, my boots crunching softly on the gravel driveway, leaving the iron gates of the estate behind me forever. I did not look back at the towering mansion that served as my luxurious prison for 15 years. Then, as I boarded the early morning Greyhound bus, heading toward the military recruitment center, I looked out the dirty, scratched window at the fading city lights of Westport. I had chosen to turn my back on billions of dollars. I had actively chosen a life of mud, blood, extreme violence, and grueling discipline over a life of gilded submission and emotional starvation. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cold glass. My breathing was steady, rhythmic, and perfectly controlled. The frightened heiress was gone. The soldier had finally awakened, ready for war. I arrived at the naval base with nothing but my canvas duffel bag and a completely hollowed-out soul. The recruiter looked up from behind his scarred metal desk, studied my manicured nails, then looked directly into the dead emptiness behind my eyes, and signed the paperwork without asking a single personal questions. The transition from silk sheets to military CS was immediate and brutal. Drill instructors screamed inches from my face on the tarmac, their spit hitting my cheek, trying to break my spirit before I even made it through the front gate on the very first day. But their sheer volume meant absolutely nothing to me. It completely lacked the psychological venom and manipulative cruelty of my brother's quiet whispers. I embraced the brutal, mind-numbing discipline. I scrubbed toilets on my hands and knees. I marched under the blazing sun until my feet blistered and bled into my socks, and I hauled heavy gear through the freezing rain until my arms shook and my vision blurred. Every single time my muscles screamed for mercy and my lungs burned for air. I pictured my brother's mocking smirk in that ballroom, and I pushed myself harder. The sheer physical exhaustion became my ultimate sanctuary, the only thing loud enough to drown out the lingering echoes of my traumatic past. The pain reminded me that I was alive, and that my body belonged entirely to me, not to the Reyes empire. I thrived in the dirt because it was honest, unlike the marble floors of my youth. I refused to settle for the standard ranks. I volunteered for the absolute worst they had to offer. I pushed my body through the unforgiving meat grinder of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, better known to the world as DevGru. I was plunged into the freezing Pacific Ocean waters at midnight, my teeth chattering violently, my hands going completely numb as hypothermia threatened to take over. Instructors tried relentlessly to break my mind, ordering me to carry a massive, waterlogged wooden log for miles through the deep sand. My male counterparts looked at me with heavy skepticism, waiting for the frail rich girl to inevitably break and ring the bell to quit, and she will. They placed bets on how many hours I would last. One of them, a 6'4" linebacker from Texas, openly told the instructor I was a liability and should be pulled from the program before someone got hurt carrying my weight. The instructor looked at me expecting a reaction. Instead, I locked my jaw and stared straight ahead. I did not speak a single word of complaint. I just shouldered the heaviest end of the log, letting the rough bark tear deep into my skin, and kept moving forward. I systematically replaced every ounce of my childhood trauma with callous skin, tactical breathing, and unbreakable focus. I forged an iron core deep within myself that absolutely could not be shattered by any man, regardless of his wealth, his rank, or the size of his ego. 2 decades blurred into a relentless, exhausting cycle of highly classified, covert deployments in the darkest, most violent corners of the globe. I found myself deployed in the freezing, jagged, and unforgiving terrain of the Korangal Valley. A night raid went catastrophically wrong. Enemy gunfire lit up the pitch-black darkness like deadly strobe lights. A heavy-caliber round tore through the freezing night air, striking my leg and completely shattering my femur bone. I collapsed heavily into the deep snow, the blinding agony threatening to knock me unconscious. But I did not scream. I bit down on my own lip until I tasted blood, quickly tying a makeshift tourniquet tied around my thigh, my hands slick with my own warm blood. I dragged my body behind a rock outcropping, checked my magazine, chambered a fresh round, and continued returning fire until the extraction helicopter touched down 17 minutes later. The flight medic later told me that most soldiers with a shattered femur pass out within 40 seconds. I had stayed conscious, accurate, and lethal for over a quarter of an hour. That shattered bone became a permanent souvenir of war, leaving me with a slight, almost unnoticeable limp for the rest of my life. A physical reminder of the brutal price of true survival, a badge of honor proving I could endure horrors my brother could never even comprehend inside his sheltered billionaire bubble. I endured the agonizing recovery, adapted my fighting style, and became a complete ghost on the battlefield. Over the grueling years, I was meticulously molded into a precision weapon for the United States government. I learned to pull the trigger with zero hesitation and absolute coldness. I neutralized 43 of the world's most dangerous gunmen across 3 continents and countless unmarked graves. I found my absolute worth and validation not in offshore bank accounts or luxury sports cars, but in extreme lethal competence. I sat alone in the dimly lit armory after my final classified mission, rhythmically breaking down my sniper rifle, scrubbing the black carbon residue from the bolt carrier. The metallic clicks of the weapon reassembling soothed my frayed nerves the way a lullaby never did, the way my brother's voice certainly never did. I was no longer the helpless victim of the Reyes family. I was a highly trained predator waiting patiently in the silence. I had built a fortress out of my own resilience, completely immune to the psychological warfare of my past. The military did not just train me, it fundamentally rewrote my DNA. In my final years of active duty service, my commanding officer assigned me a new operational partner. I stood in the holding area as they brought out a lean, heavily muscled Belgian Malinois. This was Max, a highly decorated active duty dog, soon to be known as a retired Tier 1 military canine. The handler nervously warned me that the dog was highly aggressive, deeply traumatized, and dangerously unpredictable around new personnel. He said 3 handlers before me had been bitten. The last one required reconstructive surgery on his forearm, and the base veterinarian had already submitted the paperwork to have Max permanently retired to a civilian shelter, where he would likely be euthanized within 6 months because no civilian family would take an animal that dangerous. I ignored the standard safety protocols entirely and walked straight into his wire kennel. Max instantly bared his sharp teeth, a low, menacing growl vibrating deeply in his chest, warning me to back off. I did not flinch or show a single ounce of fear. I slowly dropped to one knee, maintaining unbroken, calm eye contact, and extended my scarred, calloused hand toward his muzzle. Max suddenly stopped growling. He leaned forward and carefully sniffed my knuckles instantly, recognizing the familiar scent of gunpowder, dried blood, and shared trauma that no civilian hand could ever carry. He let out a soft sigh and pressed his heavy, warm head firmly into my open palm. In that incredibly silent exchange, two broken, discarded soldiers forged an immediate, wordless pact of absolute loyalty. 6 months later, we deployed together on a highly volatile extraction mission, deep within a fortified desert compound. The midday heat was absolutely suffocating, and the air was thick with choking yellow dust that coated my goggles and filled my lungs with grit. We were methodically clearing a narrow, dimly lit concrete corridor when my boot grazed a hidden, nearly invisible tripwire stretched low across the crumbling floor. Time slowed to an agonizing crawl. An improvised explosive device detonated just feet away. A blinding flash of searing heat and concussive force instantly threw me backward. Before the deadly, jagged metal fragments could rip through my chest and end my life, a dark, muscular blur launched off the ground. Max leaped directly into the center of the blast radius, taking the shrapnel to shield me from the worst of the explosion. The immense shock wave slammed us both violently into the crumbling concrete wall. I hit the ground incredibly hard, my vision going black for a full second, my ears ringing with a deafening high-pitched squeal as the dust settled in a suffocating cloud around us. The thick dust slowly cleared, revealing the horrifying aftermath. I dragged my battered body across the sharp debris, completely ignoring my own bleeding lacerations. Max lay motionless on his side, whining weakly from a severe shrapnel wound on his shoulder. I ripped open my tactical medical kit with my teeth, my hands shaking uncontrollably for the very first time in 20 years of combat. I pressed Succinylcholine pressure dressings as hard as I could against his torn flesh. My jaw clenched so incredibly tight that my teeth arched. I screamed for a medic into my cracked radio, but the response was static and distant gunfire. We were 3 miles deep into hostile territory, surrounded by active enemy combatants, and no one was coming. The only way out was on my feet carrying him. I hauled his limp, 60 lb body over my shoulders and carried him for 3 grueling miles through enemy-held terrain to the extraction point, my shattered femur screaming with every step, absolutely refusing to let him die. He miraculously survived the emergency surgery, but the brutal blast left a large, jagged scar across his left shoulder for the rest of his life. As I sat vigil by his metal cage in the sterile field hospital, resting my forehead gently against the wire mesh, I made a solemn, unbreakable vow. He was my true family, now bound by blood spilled in the dirt, not by any name printed on a birth certificate. The severity of our combined injuries ultimately ended both of our military careers. Mussy. I was officially honorably discharged from the Navy, with full benefits and a chest full of medals I never displayed. I immediately rejected every single lucrative private security contract offered to me by various defense corporations. 6-figure salaries, executive protection details for foreign diplomats, government consulting positions at the Pentagon, Kent Beam. Every single recruiter told me I was throwing away a fortune. I turned them all down without reading a single offer letter. I craved absolute silence and isolation, away from the relentless greed of humanity. I formally adopted Max, filing the military asset transfer paperwork myself, and we moved together to the very edge of Westport, taking up residence in a battered, drafty wooden shack where the desolate salt marsh met the crashing ocean. I permanently traded my decorated uniform for faded thrift store coats and scratched, worn-out leather boots. I became an invisible, silent ghost in a town entirely obsessed with wealth and status. Nobody noticed me. Nobody asked my name. Nobody cared about the scarred woman feeding scraps to the big dog behind the abandoned boatyard. I stood on the weathered porch one evening, tossing a tennis ball into the tall grass. Max eagerly retrieved it, dropping it happily at my scarred boots, his tail swinging in wide arcs, his brown eyes bright with a simple, uncomplicated joy that no human being had ever shown me. For the very first time in my entire tumultuous life, I was entirely at peace, protected by the only living soul I would ever truly trust. The fragile peace I found in the salt marsh was a stark, nauseating contrast to the rotting, corrupt core of Westport. Over the past 3 decades, my brother had systematically transformed this once quiet coastal town into his own personal unregulated kingdom. He did not just own the most lucrative commercial real estate. He practically owned the entire local government through aggressive bribery, blackmail, and political manipulation. He controlled the zoning board, dictated orders to the mayor's office, and completely owned the local police force, paying the chief's salary out of his own private accounts. His massive, inherited wealth acted as an impenetrable bulletproof shield, allowing him to operate a terrifying syndicate in broad daylight without facing a single consequence. I watched all of this unfold from the hidden shadows, blending perfectly into the background with the town's forgotten, discarded homeless population. I sat on park benches and watched his bulldozers violently destroy low-income housing neighborhoods to build luxury condos. I watched his police officers drag a 60-year-old shop owner named Earl out of his own hardware store on a Tuesday morning, twisting the old man's arm behind his back because my brother wanted the lot for a parking garage, and Earl's 30-year lease meant nothing against a judge on the Rehia's payroll. Earl stood on the sidewalk in his faded work apron, holding his dislocated shoulder, tears running down his weathered face, while 2 officers told him to keep walking, or they would arrest him for loitering on property that was no longer his. His wife stood behind him, clutching a box of family photographs they had grabbed on the way out, worth 30 years of honest work demolished in 15 minutes by a man who had never held a hammer in his life. I memorized every detail. I filed it away with the cold precision of an intelligence operative building a case file. The suffocating arrogance of my bloodline had become a highly contagious toxic plague that infected everyone it touched. Despite my extreme military training and lethal capabilities, I forced myself to remain completely invisible, observing his tyranny with cold, calculating detachment. I had zero intention of interfering, desperately wanting to protect the quiet, isolated life I had built with Max. Ignoring a cancer, however, does not stop it from spreading, and his poison was rapidly spilling into the streets. The absolute worst, most volatile manifestation of my brother's unchecked poison was my 19-year-old nephew, Julian. He cruised aggressively through the narrow town streets in a heavily modified matte black Mercedes G-Wagon, burning cash and treating human lives like completely disposable garbage. Because he had never faced a single consequence in his entire pampered life, fully shielded by his father's army of ruthless corporate lawyers, he had developed a terrifying God complex. He was constantly flanked by his pathetic, psychopathic accomplices, a clout-chasing, desperate internet streamer, and the cowardly, weak-willed son of the deputy mayor. Together, they treated the streets of Westport like their own private hunting ground. They terrorized local shop owners, smashing windows and daring anyone to file a report, knowing the responding officer would take one look at the Ria's name and close the case before the ink dried. I once watched my nephew throw a full cup of coffee through the open window of a food truck because the vendor took too long preparing his order. The vendor apologized. The police never came. They harassed anyone they deemed beneath their social status and broadcast their extreme cruelty live on the internet to feed their hollow, fragile egos. Apex predators born entirely from unearned privilege, completely oblivious to what real life or death violence actually looked like. Watching them operate made my blood boil, but I kept my military instincts tightly leashed. I knew exactly how fast I could dismantle every single one of them. But I also knew that breaking my cover would bring the full weight of my brother's corrupt empire crashing down on my head. I chose to remain a ghost, hoping they would simply drive past me completely unaware of the lethal weapon resting quietly under a tattered coat. The inevitable collision finally happened on a suffocatingly hot Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting quietly on a weathered, splintering wooden bench beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree in the Central Park, my eyes closed in deep tactical meditation. Max was resting peacefully on the cool grass directly at my feet, his scarred chest rising and falling with steady rhythmic breathing. We were doing absolutely nothing to disturb the peace. The tranquility was violently shattered. The deafening roar of a V8 engine tore through the park like an explosion. The massive black G-Wagon violently jumped the high concrete curb, its heavy oversized tires aggressively tearing up the manicured green grass, and parked illegally just yards away from my bench. The heavy car doors slammed open. My nephew and his gang stepped out, radiating an aggressive, chaotic, and deeply hostile energy that immediately contaminated the air. The streamer raised his expensive smartphone, already recording live, to thousands of internet viewers, absolutely desperate to capture a viral moment of cruelty. They laughed obnoxiously, their voices piercing the quiet afternoon air, scanning the park for someone to intimidate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my combat instincts flaring hard, but I remained perfectly still, continuing to project the image of a harmless, broken outcast. My nephew aggressively scanned the peaceful park, hunting for a vulnerable target to publicly humiliate for his audience. Didi, his cruel, sweeping gaze finally locked onto my faded, oversized thrift store coat, my battered, scarred leather boots, and the large, heavily scarred dog resting quietly beside me. He smirked, a vicious, deeply cruel twist of his lips that looked exactly like the expression my brother wore before destroying a rival. He turned to his camera holding friend, ensuring the lens was focused directly on my face, and pointed at me with absolute disdain. "Look at that piece of trash. I'll teach that poor old hag who really owns this town." He bragged loudly, his voice dripping with unearned authority. He marched aggressively toward my bench, swinging a heavy solid stainless steel water bottle in his hand like a blunt weapon. He stopped just a few feet away, deliberately invading my personal space, raising his voice to ensure the microphone picked up every single word. "Hey, Leash, your ugly dog. This place isn't for filthy people like you," he demanded, trying desperately to assert dominance over someone he perceived as completely powerless. I did not flinch. I did not cower or scramble to obey his ridiculous command. I simply took a slow, deep breath, reining in the monster inside me, and slowly opened my eyes to stare directly into his soul. I remained completely motionless on the splintering wooden bench, my face locked into a mask of absolute chilling emptiness. I offered zero emotional reaction to his aggressive, insulting taunts. Phoenix. I gave Max a subtle, entirely invisible tactical nod, commanding my highly trained K9 to hold his position on the grass and not engage the hostile target. I looked up at the arrogant teenager, my eyes dead and devoid of any fear, and replied with a calm, freezing monotone that cut sharply through the humid air. "The dog is under control. Go on your way, young man," I stated flatly, refusing to raise my volume or show even an ounce of intimidation. My sheer refusal to cower instantly shattered his incredibly fragile, privileged ego. He expected a terrified beggar scrambling to gravel at his feet. Instead, he hit a concrete wall, his face instantly flushed crimson with unhinged, uncontrollable rage. Being dismissed by someone he considered subhuman in front of his live internet audience was an unbearable insult that his fragile ego could not process. He aggressively stepped much closer, the veins violently popping in his neck, screaming desperately for the camera to capture his dominance. "You dare order me around? Do you know who my dad is? I could throw you in jail right now," he roared frantically, trying to weaponize his father's corrupt authority against a woman he mistook for a helpless target. Completely losing his mind over being publicly dismissed by a homeless woman, my nephew lunged forward in a blind, pathetic rage. Without a single word of warning, he launched a vicious full-force kick, aimed directly at Max's exposed ribs. But he fundamentally and fatally underestimated his target. Max was not a frightened stray cowering on a street corner. He was a veteran of the War on Terror, a weapon forged in the same fire that forged me. The dog's dormant combat instincts ignited instantly. In a terrifying blur of fluid motion, the canine gracefully dodged the heavy, clumsy boot. Max landed flawlessly on all fours, emitting a terrifying, guttural, bone-chilling snarl that vibrated through the ground and snapped his powerful jaws mere inches from my nephew's shin. The sheer speed and aggression of the counter-move caught the teenager completely off guard. My nephew shrieked in genuine high-pitched panic, stumbling backward awkwardly and falling ungracefully onto his backside in the dirt. From behind the smartphone camera, his streamer friend burst into loud mocking laughter, capturing the pathetic display for thousands of live viewers. "You're scared of a dog?" he jeered, broadcasting the humiliating failure to the exact audience my nephew was trying to impress. My nephew's face burned with sheer embarrassment, his pride completely shattered in front of the very people whose validation he craved. Driven entirely mad by the overwhelming public humiliation, my nephew's cowardice instantly morphed into lethal, unchecked malice. He scrambled desperately to his feet, his eyes wild and completely devoid of reason. He gripped the heavy, solid, stainless steel water bottle tightly in his trembling fist, stepped aggressively forward, and swung it violently downward with every single ounce of his strength, aiming directly for Max's skull. The sickening, hollow, metallic crack of steel impacting bone echoed sharply across the quiet park. "Die, you stupid dog!" he screamed maniacally, spittle flying from his lips. Max took the heavy blow and collapsed onto the grass. He whined weakly, trying desperately to stand on his paws, but his legs buckled beneath him. Seeing my loyal brother in arms, the creature who had taken shrapnel from me in a war zone, brutally struck down by a spoiled, cowardly teenager, completely shattered the heavy iron chains holding back my darkest military instincts. The civilian disguise completely evaporated. Time stopped. In a fraction of a millisecond, the Navy SEAL took total lethal control of my body. I exploded off the wooden bench with terrifying, blinding speed that defied my age and my limp. My right hand shot out like a hydraulic steel press, grabbing my nephew by the collar of his shirt. I slammed his back violently against the rough trunk of the oak tree, pinning him with such force that the air was audibly expelled from his lungs. His streamer friend scrambled backward in pure unadulterated terror, dropping the expensive phone into the grass. My nephew desperately clawed at my unyielding iron grip, completely immobilized. I leaned in extremely close, my eyes dead black and violently cold, locking onto his bulging, terrified eyes. I whispered, my voice dropping to a razor-sharp executioner's command that promised absolute violence. "If you touch my dog one more time, I will snap your neck like a dry twig." "Understood." I watched the absolute horror wash over his face as he realized he had not attacked a helpless old woman. He had attacked a monster. If you have ever had to unleash your darkest side to protect the innocent from a toxic family member, hit the like button right now. Has anyone ever pushed you to your absolute breaking point? Tell me your story in the comments. I released my crushing grip, throwing his gasping body into the dirt like a bag of discarded garbage. He scrambled backward frantically on his hands and knees, gagging, choking, and coughing violently as he desperately tried to suck air into his bruised windpipe. His terrified friends grabbed his arms, hauling him quickly toward the idling G-Wagon. In a state of sheer, uncoordinated panic, safe behind the heavy bulletproof car door, his cowardly bravado instantly returned. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me, spitting venom and tears through the open window as the engine revved loudly. "You're dead, old hag. My dad is going to tear you apart. I'll have someone kill that dog." He screamed hysterically before the SUV tires squealed violently against the asphalt, speeding away from the park. I ignored his pathetic threats completely. I immediately dropped to my knees in the dirt, ripping off my faded, oversized coat, and pressed the thick, heavy fabric as hard as I could against Max's bleeding head to staunch the rapid flow of blood. My heart rate was steady, but my mind was racing through emergency triage protocols. I knew the local police were coming. I knew exactly what kind of police they were, but my only priority was stabilizing my bleeding family member before the corrupt storm arrived. Across town, my nephew violently burst into my brother's lavish mahogany-paneled office, crying hysterically and clutching his bruised, finger-marked neck, spinning a completely fabricated story about being viciously attacked by a deranged, violent beggar woman in the park. My brother, absolutely furious that his untouchable bloodline was disrespected and physically harmed in public, did not bother asking for any facts or evidence. He did not ask to see video. He did not ask for witnesses. He grabbed his private desk phone and immediately dialed the local police chief, his loyal, highly paid attacked dog. My brother barked the unyielding dictatorial command into the receiver, with absolute authority. Arrest that at all costs and euthanize her dog immediately. Don't make me repeat myself. He slammed the phone down, satisfied that his money had solved the problem the way it always solved every problem. Meanwhile, kneeling in the dirt of the park with Max's blood soaking through my coat and into the skin of my forearms, I pulled a heavy black encrypted satellite phone from the deep inner pocket of my cargo pants. I dialed a classified secure military number that only 7 people on Earth possessed. Admiral Elena Rotova answered on the first ring, her voice sharp and alert. Rostova, it's Reyes. Saltmarsh operative compromised. Coordinates marked. Local PD is hostile and purchased, requesting federal intervention. I stated each word flat, precise, and stripped of every emotion. The Admiral's response was equally cold. A single sentence delivered without a fraction of hesitation. Hold position, Captain. We are already en route. I ended the call, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and pressed harder on Max's wound. My brother's corrupt syndicate had just declared war on the wrong ghost, and federal justice was now officially inbound. Dusk rapidly settled over the desolate salt marsh. The air inside my cramped, drafty shack was stiflingly hot as I meticulously and carefully stitched Max's severe head, wound under the dim light of a single bare bulb. His breathing was shallow, his eyes closed in pain, his paws twitching involuntarily. I worked steadily, pulling the curved needle through his torn skin with the same precise, emotionless efficiency I had used to suture my own wounds in combat zones where no medic was available. Blinding strobing blue and red lights suddenly flooded through the cracked, dirty windows, illuminating the bare walls in violent flashes. The flimsy front door was violently kicked open, splintering the thin wood entirely off the top hinge. The police chief stormed in his hand, resting aggressively on his unholstered weapon, flanked by 3 heavily armed deputies who fanned out behind him. He looked around my impoverished tiny home with utter undisguised disgust, his eyes cataloging the peeling walls, the blood-stained rug, the bare mattress on the floor. He sneered, pulling out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt with a deliberate theatrical clank. You're under arrest for assaulting Mr. Reyes' son, and we're taking the dog to be put down, he announced loudly, intending to intimidate me into immediate groveling submission. I stood up very slowly from the blood-stained rug, the curved suture needle still pinched between my thumb and index finger, my posture effortlessly straightening into absolute intimidating military rigidness. I stared right through his pathetic badge as if it were made of cardboard. That kid attacked my dog with a weapon first. This is a retired military canine. I stated my voice flat, factual, and completely devoid of the fear he expected. The corrupt chief barked out a loud, mocking laugh, completely unimpressed by my calm demeanor. I don't give a damn if it's a canine or garbage. You messed with the wrong family, he snarled, stepping forward and aggressively brandishing the cold steel handcuffs in my face. My eyes darkened, the pupils dilating until they were pitch black with lethal intent. I quietly set the suture needle down on the small wooden table beside me. I quickly calculated the distance between us, the positions of each deputy, the location of their holstered sidearms, the angle of the shattered doorway behind them. I knew with absolute certainty that I could neutralize all 4 of them before any of them managed to fully draw their weapons. But Max winded weakly from the rug behind me, and I felt his nose press against my ankle. A violent, chaotic shootout in this tiny room would guarantee his death from a stray bullet. I made the cold, tactical choice to stand down. I extended my bruised wrists forward, locking my freezing, unblinking gaze onto the chief's sweating face. If any of you touch my dog, I will consider it a hostile intrusion, and I will not be responsible for your lives. I warned him in a tone so flat and certain that it did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a weather forecast. The sheer murderous gravity and absolute certainty in my voice made the armed deputies visibly flinch and step backward, their hands trembling on their holsters. Terrified of the monster standing before them in a blood-soaked coat, they quickly locked the shack door from the outside, leaving Max safely inside, and aggressively shoved me into the back of the cruiser. The precinct wall clock ticked agonizingly slowly, the minute hand finally clicking past 9 in the evening. I was sitting completely motionless in the dead center of the cramped, freezing interrogation room. I had been aggressively chained to the heavy metal table for over 2 hours, the tight, cold steel cuffs cutting deeply into my bruised wrists with every slight movement. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with an annoying, relentless drone that would have broken most civilians within the first hour. Despite the physical discomfort and the psychological pressure they were trying to apply, my heart rate remained at a calm, perfectly steady, resting 60 beats per minute. I was not a helpless civilian trapped in a cell. I was a highly trained predator simply waiting for the trap to spring. Heavy, purposeful footsteps began to echo loudly down the barren concrete corridor, growing steadily closer. The expensive leather soles clicking against the linoleum were unmistakable. I smelled the sharp, pungent scent of his absurdly expensive cologne before the door even opened. The heavy reinforced door flew open with a dramatic, deafening bang that rattled the walls. My brother strode aggressively into the tiny room, exuding the absolute arrogant, unchecked power of a billionaire who truly believed he owned the entire building and every human being inside it. The corrupt police chief scurried in quickly, right behind him, cowering and shrinking into the far corner like an obedient, pathetic servant, eager to please his master. My brother aggressively adjusted the lapels of his impeccably tailored, absurdly expensive designer suit, squaring his shoulders and lifting his chin, preparing himself to verbally execute and completely humiliate a defenseless homeless woman who dared to touch his precious son. He sneered, looking down his nose as he prepared to deliver what he assumed would be a devastating verbal assault. Then his cold, calculating eyes slowly locked onto my face, registering my scarred features under the harsh fluorescent light, and he froze completely mid-step, his jaw going slack. All the color instantly and violently drained from my brother's face, leaving him looking like he had seen a ghost rise from a grave. His eyes bulged in sheer unadulterated disbelief as his brain desperately tried to process the impossible reality standing before him, chained to a metal table in a police precinct. "Maria, is it you?" he gasped, his voice trembling slightly as he involuntarily took a step backward, toward the heavy metal door. For a brief, fleeting microsecond, there was genuine shock on his face, perhaps even a flicker of buried guilt from 3 decades ago. But any microscopic trace of familial affection or empathy was instantly swallowed whole by his deeply ingrained ruthless narcissism. His initial shock rapidly morphed into a cruel, twisted, deeply ugly sneer. He regained his composure, straightened his tie with a sharp tug, and began to pace slowly around the metal table like a shark circling wounded prey, looking down at my faded, blood-stained clothes and chained hands with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Look at you. A ragged dog. You went to the military for all those years just to end up as this scum. You are the disgrace of the Reyes family. You hit my son, I'll throw you in prison for 20 years to clean up this stain on the family." He spat, leaning down until his face was inches from mine, his voice dripping with venom, fully believing that his immense wealth and corrupt influence still gave him absolute power over my life. Completely ignorant of the lethal reality he had just blindly walked into. I did not flinch, nor did I break my stoic composure. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show even the slightest hint of fear or intimidation. I sat perfectly erect in the uncomfortable metal chair, holding my head incredibly high, and stared straight through his expensive, carefully curated billionaire facade as if he were transparent. There was no burning anger in my eyes. Only absolute freezing, terrifying apathy. I spoke evenly, my tone completely flat and devoid of emotion, but I ensured that every single word struck his fragile, inflated ego like a highly calibrated precision missile, aimed directly at the center of his identity. You failed at being a human being, and now you've completely failed at being a father. That Rise label of yours can't cover up that rotting soul, I stated coldly, watching the words physically impact him like invisible punches. The thick purple veins began to throb violently in his forehead as my psychological strike hit dead center, completely bypassing every defense his money had built around him. His grand illusion of supreme control and untouchable superiority shattered completely under my unblinking predatory gaze. For the first time in 30 years, his money could not shield him from the brutal, ugly truth of his own pathetic existence. He completely lost his composure, unable to handle the absolute disrespect from the sister he thought he had successfully destroyed decades ago. "Shut your mouth!" my brother roared furiously, completely losing his grip on reality. His face turned a violent, unhealthy shade of purple as he aggressively raised his hand, fully intending to strike me across the face while I was chained to the table. He never even got the chance to finish the violent motion. A deafening explosive crash absolutely rocked the tiny room, shaking dust from the ceiling. The heavy reinforced interrogation door was completely obliterated, violently blown entirely off its hinges by a breaching charge. A highly coordinated tactical squad of fully armed federal agents aggressively stormed the tiny room in a blur of black tactical gear and Kevlar, their boots thundering against the concrete floor. Within 3 seconds of the breach, they violently tackled and pinned the deeply corrupt police chief hard against the concrete wall, completely stripping him of his service weapon before he could even register what was happening. The chaos immediately parted down the middle like a curtain being drawn. Admiral Elena Rotova stepped calmly and authoritatively through the shattered smoking doorway. Her crisp dress uniform was absolutely immaculate, every metal perfectly aligned, radiating ultimate, unquestionable federal military authority. Her cold, piercing eyes locked instantly onto my brother, burning holes straight through his pathetic, crumbling billionaire armor, signaling the absolute end of his corrupt reign. The cramped interrogation room fell dead silent under the Admiral's freezing, intimidating glare. No one dared to breathe. She coldly addressed the room formally and loudly announcing my true identity to the trembling, corrupt local men. She stated clearly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute federal authority, that I was Captain Maria Reyes, a highly decorated special operations military hero who had served this nation with distinction for over 20 years, and that Max was a registered, highly classified national military asset with full federal protections under the Military Working Dog Act. She then smoothly pulled a high-tech digital tablet from her aide's hands, forcefully hitting the play button. She coldly informed my trembling brother that elite federal cyber units had already succeeded in restoring the livestream video his son's cowardly streamer friend had desperately tried to delete from every platform in order to hide the evidence of the attack. The crystal-clear, irrefutable video evidence of a nephew's unprovoked, highly violent attack on a disabled military canine played loudly in the tiny room, the sickening sound of the metal bottle hitting bone echoing off the bare concrete walls. My brother's jaw dropped open in sheer horror. His entire fabricated narrative of innocent victimhood was completely vaporized in an instant. Blind, suffocating panic instantly set in as the absolute reality of the situation crushed him from every direction. My brother began to rapidly hyperventilate his manicured hands, shaking violently as the billionaire armor completely fell apart. Acting entirely on deeply ingrained corrupt instinct, he desperately reached into his tailored designer jacket pocket, hysterically screaming that he could write a massive check, that he could make this all go away. Openly trying to bribe the stoic federal agents in the room, while a dozen witnesses watched. The federal agents did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. They slammed his face roughly against the cold concrete wall, aggressively ripping his arms behind his back. They loudly read him his Miranda rights in full officially and publicly charging him with bribery, fraud, and political manipulation. He sobbed pathetically, begging for a lawyer, his dignity completely stripped away in front of the very police force he used to own. Simultaneously, on the other side of the room, a federal agent aggressively ripped the silver badge clean off the corrupt police chief's chest, letting it hit the linoleum floor with a heavy final thud that echoed through the silent building. The supposedly invincible Reyes syndicate the empire that had terrorized an entire town for 3 decades. The machine that had crushed shop owners and silenced journalists and purchased judges was completely dismantled in less than 60 seconds by people whose loyalty could not be bought at any price. I stood up slowly from the metal table, rolling my stiff shoulders to relieve the agonizing tension that had built over the past several hours. Admiral Rostova stepped forward, gracefully, pulling a small silver key from her uniform pocket, and personally unlocked my heavy steel handcuffs. The cold metal fell away, clattering loudly against the table. I quietly massaged my deeply bruised purple wrists and walked slowly and deliberately toward the shattered door frame where the door used to hang. I paused briefly beside my brother. He was helplessly pinned to the wall by 2 massive agents, his 1,000 tie ripped loose, his perfectly styled hair matted to his sweating forehead, openly weeping and shamelessly begging me to tell them to stop pleading for familial mercy that he had never once shown me. I offered him absolutely no pity, no gloating words of cheap revenge, and absolutely no forgiveness. He did not deserve my voice. I simply gave him one final silent look of absolute soulic, crushing disgust, confirming without a single word that he was completely dead to me, and I walked straight out of the room without looking back. I strode confidently out the front glass doors of the corrupt precinct, pushing my way past the chaotic, swarming scene of arriving federal tactical units securing every entrance of the building. The incredibly cool, crisp night air immediately hit my face, washing away the suffocating stench of corruption and cheap cologne that had permeated every corner of that building. The loud wailing sirens of federal command vehicles echoed sharply through the dark streets, signaling the absolute permanent end of the Reyes family's tyrannical reign over Westport. I did not bother to look back at the flashing red and blue lights, or the destruction of my brother's empire. I slowly zipped up my faded oversized thrift store coat, lowered my head against the cold wind, and began the long, quiet walk back toward the desolate salt marsh. I had a much more important mission now. I was going home to treat my dog and make sure my true family healed. That was the only mission that had ever truly mattered. Everything else, the medals, the kills, the classified files, the billionaire brother rotting in federal custody behind me, none of it weighed a single ounce compared to the 60 pounds of scarred loyal muscle waiting for me in a drafty shack by the ocean. 2 quiet, peaceful weeks passed in absolutely undisturbed silence. I sat comfortably on the weathered steps of my wooden porch, casually reading the front page of a discarded local newspaper I had found in a recycling bin in town. The bold black headlines confirm the total, unrecoverable ruin of my brother's massive real estate empire. Sweeping federal indictments had permanently frozen all his offshore and domestic assets, completely liquidating every cent of his power. My arrogant nephew was currently crying in a county jail cell, permanently denied bail by a federal judge, finally facing the harsh, violent reality of the criminal justice system he had arrogantly thought he was entirely immune to. The corrupt police chief was anxiously awaiting a lengthy trial in a maximum security federal penitentiary, stripped of his badge, his pension, and every shred of authority he had abused. The heavy oppressive shadow that suffocated the town of Westport for decades had been permanently lifted. I tore the front page from the newspaper spine, folded it twice, and walked inside. I laid the newspaper flat in the bottom of Max's wooden sleeping crate, smoothing the bold headline about my brother's indictment under the old wool blanket, where my dog rested his healing head every night. The man who ordered the death of my family was now lancing the sleeping crate of my family. His mugshot was pressed flat beneath the warm body of the very dog he tried to have euthanized. That felt exactly right. I walked slowly out onto the sandy beach, my calloused hands tucked deep into the warm pockets of my faded winter coat. The snort's early morning air was incredibly crisp, biting, and entirely clean, completely untainted by my brother's venomous, suffocating presence. I stopped right at the water's edge, picked up a smooth, flat stone from the wet sand, and skipped it hard across the freezing surface. It bounced 3 times before sinking. I used to do the exact same thing as a little girl standing on the riverbank behind the Reyes estate, long before my brother turned that riverbank into a private helicopter pad. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, unhindered breath of salty air. For the very first time in over 30 long, exhausting years, I felt the crushing, toxic weight of the Reyes family name finally and permanently lift off my scarred shoulders. The psychological war was over. The siege was broken. I was truly, undeniably, completely free. A familiar cold, wet nose gently nudged the palm of my hand. I crouched down deeply into the wet sand and gently scratched Max behind his soft ears. His head was still carefully wrapped in fresh, clean, white medical bandages from the severe impact. But his brown eyes were incredibly bright, alert, and full of life. He leaned his heavy muscular weight directly into my chest, recovering beautifully and rapidly from the brutal strike he endured. We sat quietly together in the cold sand, listening to the rhythmic, soothing crashing of the ocean waves against the shore. Two heavily scarred soldiers, battered, broken, and discarded by the civilized world, but entirely unbreakable when we stood together. I pressed my forehead gently against his warm fur, whispering a quiet, heartfelt thank you to the only living creature on this earth that never betrayed me. As the bright morning sun rose higher into the clear sky, deeply warming the freezing sand beneath us, the final undeniable truth crystallized in my mind with absolute clarity. True family is not the people who randomly share your biological bloodline, but are more than willing to trample your soul for $1. True family is the loyal comrades who have bled with you in the pitch-black dark. The brave souls who step directly in front of the deadly shrapnel when the entire world explodes around you. Because in the end, when the dust settles and the sirens fade and the courtrooms empty, no amount of dirty inherited wealth will ever be enough to buy true loyalty. Money will never defeat honor. I stood up slowly, whistled sharply into the wind, and we walked home together along the shore, leaving the past behind us forever. If you believe that true family is proven by loyalty and who stands with you in the darkest times, not just who shares your blood, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Who is the person that defended you when you were at your lowest? Share your thoughts down below.